My name's Neville Williams. I was in Korea 1951-52 and I was trained as an infantryman and then put into the regimental signals as a lance corporal signaller.
Okay, so Neville, where are you from? What was your life like before as a boy? But where are you from? Just tell me a bit about your family.
I was brought up in Chester and my family go back to about 16 something in Chester. My father was an ex-professional soldier in the 14 War. He got wounded 3 separate times and survived, which not many people do. So I had what I thought was a good upbringing. I had a brother who was older than me, 10 years older than me, but he eventually died when he was 31 of diabetes in those days, which they couldn't treat very well. But I had I thought a happy youth. I lived on a council house estate there, which is brand new in its day when my mother and father moved in. And in those days, people didn't move much, so everybody knew everybody. And I went to a local school, and then I went to a school in town in Chester, Love Street Secondary Modern School.
Did you learn much about, did you know anything about a career when you were a boy?
About Korea?
Yeah, as a boy.
Didn't even know it existed. When I first found out we were going to Korea with the regiment, I had to look on a map to find out where it was. I don't think hardly anybody would have ever heard of it before the war. And the colonel, when he announced it, we'd done a lot of battle training, so I knew we were going somewhere, either possibly Korea or Malaya. And he said, I'm very pleased to announce that we're going to Korea. And everybody, where's Korea? So to us, it was just a foreign country miles away, and we didn't know what to expect, really. As a young man brought up in Chester, I thought it was a good time to be brought up, really, because we saw a little bit of the war. The town got bombed, probably an overspill from when they attacked Liverpool and that, but things were very stable. People, a lot of families worked on British Rail and they'd be there all my life. My father worked for Lever Brothers, Stoke Margarine. He was there from 1920 when he came out of the army till he retired. So there was a great period of stability. School teachers in the war were all experienced men because the young people had gone to war, and so all the teachers, men and women, were very I enjoyed my school days. I ended up as head boy, and we had plenty of sport. I played a lot of football and cricket, but I was a very happy time as far as I was concerned. Everybody, we swam in the local river, River Dee, and we used to roam the fields for miles around. The farmers didn't mind, and so to me it was a very, very happy time, actually.
I've got to ask, Neville, obviously just touched upon your youth and freedoms you have, but you're also quite a good footballer. So just tell me a bit about your love of football and how you did.
Well, when I came out the forces, I was 23. One of the scouts for United, he was a general scout. I think he got paid by various people. He'd worked at the same company as me, Chester Hydraulic. He talked about it before. He said, what about going to United for the trial? And I said, I was playing with Pathelli in the Welsh League. I said, yeah, okay. So I got a nice letter from Bert Wally. And sadly, Bert got killed in the plane crash eventually. But I got a nice letter from Bert saying, well, in the summer holidays, we'd like you to come over for a week. So I went over, and I was housed with most of the team. All the single men were in like a large mansion, and the company looked after them very well, good meals and that, but they were quite disciplined. Give an example, one day we were in the clubhouse, and I don't know whether it was Henry Coburn, one of them, he was just having a glass of shandy, which is nothing really, But when Matt Busby walked in, he hid it under the table. They really respected Busby, and Bert Wally, who was the coach, and Jimmy Murphy, they were the brains behind the outfit. And so each day you went down to the trial pitch, did a bit of training, and that wasn't any bother to me because I belonged to Whittle Harriers and I trained hard, and I think I was a bit fitter than some of them, to be honest. And we'd split up into two teams and have trial matches, and they would sometimes stop the match to talk tactics, or quite often Bobby Charlton would be pulled up and told, you know, you don't tackle that way because you could get hurt, or, you know, just use your left foot in this match, which I was familiar with some of the training because I had done a bit at Chester when I was very young. And in the wartime, because they had some good professionals, I got a bit of good advice off people like Don Welsh, who was an English international. Tommy Asprey was a Welsh international. They used to take me on one side and give me a bit of instruction. Although I was only 15, they did take me along with the reserves the odd time, but I didn't get a match. And so in the end, I stopped going because I wanted to play rather than, you know, but in those days it would be very unusual for somebody of 15 to get into a reserve team. But nevertheless, I learned quite a lot of them while I went training there. And then at the end of it, they said, you're good enough and strong enough and you're not frightened of making a tackle or getting... But they said that we want to offer you a short-term contract, 6 months, because we're not sure whether... If you'd have come here when you was 15, they said we would have definitely made, you know, first-team player, but they said we've got to make sure whether you play the United way, which I understood what they meant, because the professional game is playing to orders and various things that you don't, you know. So then as regards football, I went back and I eventually went to Northwich, because the problem with Pwllheli was I had to get a train to Llandudno and a taxi from Llandudno each week to get to Pwllheli. So I'd have to set off at 10 o'clock in the morning. I wouldn't get home till tea time, and that was a bit heavy going, the travelling bit really, for an hour's football. So I signed on for Northwich and I played for them. And eventually when I was about 25, I got a cartilage, and that put me out of the game, because once you get a cartilage, I got it operated on when I was about 30, but it didn't stop me from doing athletics. I used to run for Whittle Harriers. I won their quarter-mile championship and I was second in the 100 yards, but to me I enjoyed it. It was just good fun, that, really.
Just tell me a bit about what you recall of your, you know, conscription and the call up and where. Just tell me a bit about that.
Well, when I went in, I thought, well, I want to go into an infantry battalion because I was an engineer. I'd finished serve me time, but I thought I want to get as a PTI, as a physical training instructor, and the best chance was in the infantry. And I thought it'll be a bit of a break from engineering. So I volunteered to go in the Royal Welsh Fusiliers myself. They sent me down to Brecon because that's where you had the Royal Welsh Fusiliers, the South Wales Borderers and the Welsh Regiment. So my first 6 weeks, I was in the RWF, Royal Welsh Fusiliers, but as soon as we finished the initial training, they wanted to make the Welsh Regiment up in numbers. So I got transferred into the Welsh Regiment. We then went on battle training into Norfolk. It was very realistic stuff, you know, even some of it with live ammunition firing overhead and digging in and lying in the frost and all the rest of it. And I was at that time, I was made into a Lance Corporal almost within the first 6 weeks of training. But then just about 2 months before we were due to go to Korea, and at that time we didn't know we were going to Korea. We were pretty certain we were going somewhere because of the amount of battle training. I was then put onto a course as a regimental signaller, and also another course as a stretcher bearer. But once they told us we were for Korea, then I was into the regimental SIGs, and of course the way that works is one or two signallers are attached to each company in the battalion when you get on active service to keep communications open. So in the something like the October of 1951, the colonel got the battalion on parade and then said he was very pleased to say that we were all going to Korea. Everybody wasn't as pleased as him, but that was the thing. And in those days, people never travelled very much. They couldn't afford it. But it was a very interesting journey because we went out on the Empire Ferry, and we stopped at through the Bay of Biscay into the Mediterranean. We stopped at Port Said, and then we stopped at Aden, and then we stopped at Colombo, which is Sri Lanka now, and then again we stopped at Singapore, and then eventually we ended up stopping at Hong Kong for a few days. And at Hong Kong, the battalion marched around the town, and then when we'd done that, it seemed puzzling at the time. They reformed us into different combinations and marched round again. But I actually had a pretty good idea why, because my father had told me in the 14 war they did similar things. And the idea was to fool the enemy spies into thinking there was more battalions arriving than what there was. So
do you remember, you had the goat when you did the march, didn't you?
Pardon?
You had the Welsh goat.
Yeah, now the poor old goat, he was pretty sick on the boat because it was very rough in places when we were travelling out there. There was some violent weather. And we were on a ship called Empire Ferry, which was a German battleship in the war, and they commandeered and turned into a troop ship. So he didn't take kindly, the poor old goat. He used to have a goat major whose full-time job was to look after the goat, and they used to dress him up when they had a parade. He led the parade.
I heard that on the march in Hong Kong, that basically the goat fainted, and there was problem. You know, there was a real sort of issue over morale because they thought, oh God, you know, the goat's died. It hadn't died. It had fainted because it would collapse.
Oh, I didn't know he collapsed, but I did know he was very ill on the travelling out there. He didn't like the rough weather on the boat. It didn't suit him at all, and they were all worried about him. They took him quite serious. And of course, when you were on parade, the goat not only led the parade, but the Assault Pioneers Battalion, they're the chaps who lay mines and get unexploded bombs. They're not the same as a pioneer regiment. They're basically, they are infantrymen, but trained in handling explosives, and if they want to blow a trench up, they're the lads that'll do it. So they lead the battalion, and the sergeant major, who actually became my sergeant major in Korea for a while, is the only man in the British Army allowed to have a beard at that time, which was unusual. So we then went from Hong Kong, very rough crossing across the China Sea, to Busan. And our first impressions of Busan were not good at all. You could smell it before you got to it. It had a shanty town miles deep right round the city, and the city was very old and run down. The people were very polite. They all bowed to you when you talked to them and that. But I was very impressed with the orphan problem. The children, little orphans, were everywhere, and if you stood still, they wanted to clean your shoes for a few pennies. We used to let them do it, and we were there for about 4 or 5 days before going up to the front. I always remember that.
Okay, so you then, after 4 or 5 days in Busan, what were you doing there? What was the purpose of it?
Well, in Busan, it was just a transit camp. it was a mile or so outside the city, and it was just to sort us out and get a bit of winter kit, you know, and generally, you know, sort out who was who and what was what, and just a staging post really. We went into the town a couple of times, but we weren't very impressed with it. And the next thing was a 48-hour journey on a very old train up to the front line, and that was a very well, again, it was very interesting, but very unusual. All we passed was little villages in those days. It's been amazing the way Korea has recovered, but it was only little villages, and each time there would be people trying to sell you bits and pieces. I remember I bought a little ring with Korea on that was made from an old brass bolt originally, I could tell. And it turned out when we got up to the front line, we used to have porters working for us, and they were brilliant craftsmen. They were farming type people. They were absolutely first-rate people, honest and hard-working. The only thing they weren't allowed to have weapons, but they, other than that, they did everything we did. They dug trenches, and they knew the land better than we did, so we learnt a lot off the Koreans. You know, I had a great admirer of them because they were so hard-working and nice, honest, simple people, you know. So we had this journey. Then when we got up there, I was allocated as a regimental sixer to the Salt Pioneers, and we went on to what they then named Pioneer Hill. They used to give them numbers or descriptions of different hills, and we were the leading platoon in the battalion. It was the most forward position. Across the valley, probably about a mile or so away, were the Chinese dug in on other hills, and in the centre of the valley there was a natural ridge which eventually our people occupied by day and by night. It was a sort of suicide position to let anybody know if there'd have been a big attack. And then there was a big hill called 169, which during the winter was alternately visited by our troops and by the Chinese, and eventually they put a hate target on it one time, and every gun in the division opened up on it one morning. They dropped two 500-pound bombs on it, two red marker bombs first of all to make sure they got the right one, and then they dropped two 500. We could feel our position shake when they dropped, and they eventually blew the top off it, but they still couldn't get the Chinese off it, the devils. They were very tenacious. I had a great admiration for the Chinese, really. And we were on that all winter, and of course, as the winter progressed, the temperatures dropped -40, and if you stood still, you could feel your boots sticking to the ground. And by that time, we dug bunkers. And me being an ex-tradesman, I was probably a bit more knowledgeable than some. So, you know, we made sure we lined it with logs. We cut trees down, and Koreans helped us. And then we would put logs on the roof, and then soil, then bricks, and tarpaulins and things. So we made them as comfortable as we could. We made beds out of old machine gun belts. Machine gunners were just across the valley from us. And the company built cook houses into the sides of the hill, away from the, you know, on the reverse side. And I must say the food wasn't too bad. They used to send up supplies, and the Koreans helped out. They built food ovens and things which were very efficient.
What was this story about the Korean hooch? Did you ever drink it?
Oh, well, I didn't, but one of my mates did. I can probably tell you that a bit farther along, maybe. But it probably fits in. Our Corporal Oram, when we were in barracks, he'd been a professional boxer, I think, and I wanted to be a PTI, and he started letting me help him moving towards that, you know. And just before we landed, because I was always very friendly, he said, he was leaning on the rail of the boat, and he said to me, I'm not going to be coming back from here. And I said, oh, don't be down. And he'd been in Eritrea, he'd seen a bit of army life, but there was like an inevitability about it, what he said. I thought, it was hard to argue against. He just seemed to know. And he got at home, he got a little baby at home. They just got a baby then. Anyway, when we got to Korea, the first man to be killed was called Bob. He went into an observation bunker and they got a direct hit. And he was the first man to be killed. You don't forget things like that. And it was sad because now when my book came out, his son, who'd been a baby when he was there, he must have got a copy, and he wrote me a nice letter, and I wrote back to him, and he sent me a photograph of Corporal Oram when he'd been in the army boxing team. He'd been in the army boxing team one time. But he was the first man to be killed.
I mean, obviously he wasn't the last man that you'd have known, but how did you deal with death in Korea as a young man?
Well, I think, like in most wars, once you got there, the thing was survival. And I think that's true in most wars. And therefore you get a very strong bond between the people you're working with, because you're all in it together. One or two fellas cracked up, but the ordinary bloke doesn't think nothing of that because it can happen to anybody. It's just one of those things. And a couple of the fellas I had, again, I tell the story in the book, but they just couldn't take it, and whatever. And
what happened to them?
They tend to shove them behind the line in one of the echelons, I say, working so they're not in direct contact. One lad who was in barracks, he woke up one morning, he was a very strange character, and he said, I fell out. We had one on a second-storey building at Colchester. He said, I fell out the window last night, and he wouldn't get out of bed. So they sent for the sergeant, and he got a few marks and scratches on him and on his leg and that, and he says, I fell out the window, I had a nightmare. He had the odd nightmare. When we'd been on schemes, he woke up shouting a couple of times. And anyway, they whisked him off and we never saw him again. So he never actually went to Korea. So he'd be one that, for whatever reasons. And then when we got out there was another lad called Johnson, and he was trigger happy. He was like very, very nervous to the extent he put hand grenades in his pillar and his bunker. Well, I knew this. I often used to go round with the sergeant major at night, checking on the lads to see they were all standing to it, stand down, at the evening and the morning. That was a thing I often did, you see. And I knew about this Johnson. And we went round this day, and he said, when he said halt, because it was like half light, and Johnson said, halt, who goes there? The sergeant major had forgotten the password, which they used to change every so often. And quite often they were funny passwords. They reckoned the things Chinese couldn't say very well. They might say like Mickey Mouse or whatever. Anyway, I knew the password, so I just said, which we often use, it's all right, Johnson, it's Neville and Sergeant Walsh. Oh. And we heard his rifle go, push one up the spout, you see. So the sergeant major looked at me, he said, Johnson, what would you have done if I hadn't have answered up? He said, shot you. Well, that's the copybook answer, but in real life it wasn't. So when he says to me, I said, well, he's a bit on the nervous side, because when we first got on his position, they found in the middle of the night, they found a Chinese on the edge of one of the bunkers round by him. And he must have come to have a look who'd taken over, but they shot away pretty quick. They fired a few flares and that, but it was just, he must have been on his own for whatever reason. But anyway, he says, I'm going to send him down the standing patrol. Well, this standing patrol was in this ridge of land, in no man's land, and it was manned day and night with a section in the day and a platoon at night, on the basis that if there'd been a big attack, they'd have just had time to say they're coming. They'd have had it. But was very nerve-wracking. And he said, I'll send Johnson down. I said, well, I don't think it's a good idea, because I said, he's so nervous, I don't think he'd be much use to his mates if you did. Anyway, the Sergeant Major Walsh, an Irish fella, he sent him down the standing patrol. So halfway through the day next day, you very rarely saw movement between the standing patrol in the daytime and things, because it was like an open pathway, bulldozed pathway back to our position. And there's this figure coming down the road on his own. So I said to a Sergeant Jones, I said, that's going to be Johnson now, so we better go down and meet him. So the pair of us went down, and when he come, he said, what you doing, Johnson? He said, oh, I'm going home. And you could tell the look on his face, he just, this is not for me, I'm going home. So Sergeant Jones says, you keep an eye on him, and I'll just get back on the telephone and phone battalion headquarters. And so off he bobbed, and I stopped talking to him for the first. I said, what's that? He says, oh, it's no good to me there. They said, I can't be bothered with that. It was like like in another world, a bit matter of fact. So when the sergeant come back, he says, oh, get a couple of the lads to escort him, take him back to battalion headquarters. And off he went. We never saw him again. But we never thought anything of it. We never thought like, he's a coward or nothing like that. It's just how life is sometimes. So you have this bond of all working together and doing the best you can to help each other. But when somebody gets killed, I had a few mates, a lad called Rowe, he got killed. Another lad, Harris, who was loaned us he was a rifleman, but he was loaned to us as a signaller, because we only had two, at that time we only had two of us, a corporal and myself, and we were doing 24 hours on and 6 hours off for about 6 weeks, which is heavy going. So he was a right nice lad from down Devon, lovely broad accent, but he got hit by a stray shell just walking along a road, and I often thought, what an awful thing for his mother. So it was something you accepted, but you just had to get on with it. You didn't dwell on it too much. Later in the year, when we went on to Hill 355, where there'd been it's the biggest hill in the division, where there'd been some really big battles, there were lots of dead Chinese on the wire, and they started to get smelly when the warmer weather, and the lads had the rotten job of digging pits and throwing them in and so on. Again, you thought, very awful business really, but it just had to be done, and you did it. The only thing that would strike you probably forcibly is this one of a bond between mates and people working together, so you could trust each other, that you would always, you would stick. But another chap who cracked up, I think his name was Burns, we were being heavily shelled one day, and we'd gone out on a line to 355. We had a line to each company now, and I nearly got a lump of shrapnel in my head myself diving down once. It just dropped in front. We got up to this position, and they were shelling like nobody's business, and the roof was shaking and dust, and everybody was a bit nervous. But this particular lad, I think his name was Burns, but anyway, he was really, shaking a bit. And Jim Sibby and my mate who was up there, we were making fun of it to try and calm him down. We were pretending to be mice and gently talking. I mean, we were scared, but we tried to make light of it. But a few days later, apparently, they had to send him back. I never saw him again because he just couldn't cope. But you never thought the worst of the fella.
Let me ask you about your role in signals. What were you doing on a day-to-day basis?
Well, first thing when you went on a new site, like we did in the winter, build yourself a bunker. So it was very rough for a week or so. While you got that done, you might be under canvas or just a very crude hole and a few things across it while you did. So the idea then, build yourself a decent bunker. And the Korean porters were brilliant because they'd been in the war longer than us, so they knew they knew the drill, and usually they chop a few trees down and we drag them over, and so that was priority. While you got the cookhouse set up, you had what they call combat rations. That would be a box, a small box about a foot long by about 9 inches wide, and there'd be enough in there to last you a day. You had things like some of the tins food, like meat. I think it was supplied by the Yanks, or the Yankee idea. You would have a fuse, you could light the fuse and it would burn through and it would be hot, and then you could open the top and eat it that way. So we didn't like them because, I mean, it was not brilliant, but that would be for a week or so while you got settled in. Then once you got settled in, the cookhouse would be supplied regularly, and you get a cook to, and in the winter, because it was so cold, we used to eat, everybody put about a stone or so on, because it was one way of I even saw a chap eat 12 rounds of bread one day. I couldn't believe it. I just counted it, but you couldn't do that in normal life. But when you got -40, your tea freezes within about 3 or 4 minutes. If you don't drink it, you got ice on you. And your gun, you'd have to cock a Bren gun if you're on guard. You'd have to keep cocking it, although you got special oil. If you didn't keep cocking it every now and then, it would probably freeze up, you know.
What was the set that you were using then?
The what?
What signal set were you using?
Well, when we first got out there, we had a very old-fashioned signal stuff. It was chronic, really. It was a set. It was based on crystals from the last war. And so it didn't ring, it just flickered a light. So when you were on duty, you'd have to watch this darn thing nearly all the while, because if you turned away, if it flickered and you missed it, somebody'd be saying they've been trying to ring you and they couldn't get you. And we had to lay lines to every one of our companies, plus a line back to the 25-pounders, the heavy artillery and other people. And then once you were laid, your job was to keep them open 24 hours a day. So you'd normally have 3 signallers to do that 24 hours a day. And then when you weren't on duty, you'd often be cutting trees down, on improving, digging holes. We're great ones in the British Army for laying wire. One position we were in with the mortars, we had about 7 strands of wire before we left. When we got there, we took over from the Yanks. There wasn't a strand of wire, but by the time we finished, there was, 7 with scrambled wire in between. So you might be doing that. And of course, you got used to some of in the winter, the earpieces would sometimes not work too good. So you carry spare ones in your pocket to keep them warm and then put them in. You learn tricks of the trade, You had call-ups every morning. You would have to answer up to control to tell them that, you were there and everything was okay. And there was one time where the Chinese tried to, they did manage to get us on. They must have got somebody to imitate us, in which case the control would say, get off the air, and you'd get off for a while and change the code numbers. We also had special code numbers, American X code, so that if there was something very important, which was not too often, that would affect the whole division, you would copy these letters down, which meant nothing, and then you'd have to get your sheet out and work out what the code was really saying. I had a very amusing incident on one of those. One of my mates, who was a likeable but a rum lad, he got mentioned in dispatches, but going on a patrol. But he was a little bit of a villain. He got the wrong side of a major, and the major sent him back to one of the echelons, which he didn't like. He wanted to be with the lads. So he sent a message out on the wireless on this ops code, which he very rarely used. And as we copied it down and translated it, everybody in the division would do it said, up you from someone in rear div. And the control says, get off the air. And they were all trying to find out who it was. I knew who it was by his voice, but he managed to bluff it out. They never found out it was Lewis. It was Fred. But because they were pretty sure it was him, they sent him back up the front which was what he wanted anyway. He didn't want to be in the back, he wanted to be with his mates.
You had an incident in the book about where you could listen in on signals as well, and you knew that Parry was going.
Well, because some lines would come through us, it could be that they couldn't get a line to B company from a particular company because of the geography or the difficulty. So it might be a case that, or the distance or the trees in between interfere with the reception. So in that case, you had a chart in which you've got this all recorded, and you would have to phone, we'll say, B company in order to get to one of the echelons or somebody. So you would get a condition sometime where you had to work through a different one. But the control, when they called you up every morning, used to ask you what strength. You had 1 to 5. So you'd say strength 5, you know, whatever company with your password or whatever it was, crucial 4 or whatever, which again, they change every so often.
So if somebody was patching through from HQ to one of the echelons via you, you were able to listen in.
That's right. So there were quite, because we were a very forward company, we had quite a few lines to the HQ and different ones. So we could listen in to conversations. And of course, our own officer would sometimes say, put me through to such and such. So we knew what we'd be there while he was talking, wouldn't we, you know? And so we were like a source of information. We always knew what was going on. And there's 1 or 2 funnies in my book where things were said, and one major we had that he was in his mid-40s. He got an MC, but in actual fact, he was a bundle of nerves, and he wasn't so good really, very narky and niggly, and we were glad to see the back of him. But the CO put a word out that there was a course going in Chinese in Curie, the island, and he must have put in for it. And it was only a hoax to find out who wanted to be in the line and who didn't. And the call to the CO we were able to listen to, he phoned up Parry and he said, you put in for this course? He said, yeah. He said, well, didn't you realise it was a hoax? He said, I didn't expect one of my majors to put in for this. So the next thing is, Parry was made a liaison officer to go back behind the line, which would suit him anyway. He was very nervous. I think he'd probably seen enough in the last war, and so we were always a source of information, and if we didn't know, we could probably find out if.
Just you're a signaller. How often were you out doing patrols, or were you not with the radio men out on the patrol? You're more of a linesman, keeping lines open.
Yeah, I didn't. I didn't actually do any patrol work as such, but I used to what they call the standing patrol, which was a nerve-wracking. I used to go out there pretty often because the officer would go out from out. We were the nearest to him, so at night time, he would go out to see how they were going on. We'd take him a few sweets or something, you know. But the 2 lads, they'd have a platoon dug in on this ridge, and then out in front of them, 200 yards in front of them, there's minefields and that. You'd have 2 blokes who were the farthest forward in the whole company, which was a bit nerve-wracking. So we'd go out and we'd go and have a word with them and have a chat and say give them a few fags or whatever. And I used to do quite a lot of that because the officer would nearly always, you know, get you as the signal to go with them. And me being a lance corporal, if they went off site in the day to do some blasting, to blow trenches and stuff, I'd be the only NCO that was left on the section. So I was the only person there to take prisoners. I had this occasion where they rang me up once from the standing patrol in the daytime and said, are there some North Korean soldiers going through on a patrol? And I said, not to my knowledge, because you would be told that. So I said, I'll ring battalion and then ring you back. So I rang battalion. They said, no, definitely not. They must be enemy, trying to bluff the way back through the lines. So they said, take some men and arrest them. So I picked up, the lads were quite quick. I said, you know, half a dozen. So half a dozen, you know, take some rounds with you, take your gun and take a few grenades with you in your belt. And we trotted down there. And when we got there, there was about 6 of these. It was hard to tell whether they were North Koreans or whether they were Chinese. And the blokes who were on the standing patrol, one of them had got the machine gun on them, but they were arguing they hadn't actually taken the ammunition off them or nothing. And the officer, I went straight to the officer who seemed to be the officer of these prisoners, and he was starting to talk, and I thought, this is not good, this. So I said to the bloke with the machine gun, I said, if he tries anything, shoot him, shoot the officer. And then I said to the lads who were with me, right, quickly, pick one each. And when I say go in, take the arms off them and take the grenades out of the belt. You know, make them put their hands on the head. I said, I'll take the officer. So I went in, and they didn't know what to do for sure, but really they could see they were outgunned. So we arrested them, and then we made them put their hands on their heads, and then we put them in a single file, and we marched them back down to BHQ. About halfway back, I could see they were thinking of whether to make a run for it across the paddy fields, you know. So I said, well, if they do run, shoot them in the legs, if they try to. And I said, slam a bolt up on your rifle, you know, bang the bolt up. And when they did that, they all got a bit windy and put their hands back on their heads again. So we took them back to BHQ, and I heard later they got an awful lot of information off them. I suspect, and apparently the story I got was that they'd been sent on this like suicide patrol for some misdemeanor to try and collect information. Because, you know, to be on our side of the wire in daylight is not a very clever thing to do. So I don't know, but I have a feeling they might have bribed them by saying, like, you know, you can stop in South Korea afterwards or whatever. I don't know, but they reckon they got quite a bit of information. But I never heard the official end until when I wrote my book. The education sort of liaison officer wrote to me, and he said, you would have got it mentioned in the dispatches. He said, if we'd have known, but not that that matters, but you've got funny situations like that that could crop up out of nowhere, and you know, you can't get a book to read about it. You just got to try and make your mind up on the time and see what happens. But
tell me about the wildlife, because you make a mention of snakes and rats and stuff.
The Koreans were very well versed in it. There were snakes around. But funny enough, the biggest ones apparently were harmless, because the Koreans used to pick them up and play with them. One about 6 foot long with black and white stripes. And then one of them, he said to me one day, he said, watch this, and he chopped its head off. And he said, that will still keep wriggling till sundown, and it did. I mean, you see some funny things, don't you, in life? And I had a case once where I was chasing a line, and as I pulled it up, right in front of me, that we were warned there was an adder, a type very similar to our adder in England. And this must have been asleep under this tree or bush. And as I pulled it, the pair of us are looking at each other, and I jumped back, you know, and the snake must have thought the same, and he shot off. But ever after that, I was a bit more cautious, because in the winter, everything died because of this cold. But in the spring, everything used to come to life. And you could see things, we used to measure them, things would grow in the night, you know, because it went from cold to humid. Well, we had 2 weeks of solid rain, very misty type rain, where everything flooded and the bunkers flooded and everything. And then the plants absolutely jumped out the ground. And so everything came to life. And then we had another case where they were doing some wiring in the paddy fields. And I heard somebody with a brain gun, with a Sten gun, firing. So I went to have a look, and one of the corporals who'd been there, he turned round, and one of these snakes must have been sat up ready to strike. And he dashed and grabbed his Sten gun, which he must have put on the bank. But by the time he got back, of course, the snake had gone. He was probably as frightened as him, but he was that annoyed, he fired off a whole load of bullets all around. So, and we had cases where people were having a bathe. We used to dam up streams and make a bit of a pool and things like that, or a shower. And there are cases where one or two, they found them in the water, you know, swimming about, which wasn't... Somebody said they can't bite you when they're in water, but I didn't particularly believe that. And they used to send little notes around as well, each warning you of certain things that perhaps you shouldn't do. And you did mention about drink, didn't you? Well, one of the ones, we got the note too late. One of our corporals swapped our naffy baths for Korean yen. But he didn't know that Korean yen had no value. Because of the war, it had become valueless. So he got a big stack of notes and thought he got a lot of money, but in actual fact it wasn't. Nobody wanted it. The Koreans didn't want it. So in the end he said to a Korean porter who was going on leave, they had leave every 6 months for a couple of weeks, he said, "Can you get me some to drink?" And when he came back, he had a great big quart bottle with this hooch in, which I believe is made of rice. And then one night the corporal decided to have a bit of a do with his mate, with the cook. And the next thing I know, he staggers in the bunker, absolutely all over the place. And I says, if the major catches you, be in trouble. I said, come on. So he was sharing a bunker with me. So I ran him back down the trenches and pushed him in his bunker. I said, stop there and I'll do your guard tonight, you know. And the cook, so I went to see the cook. I says, how are you? He says, well, if I lie down, he says, you won't get any breakfast. He says, I'll never get up. He said, my head's killing me. So I said, well, I'll bring you some coffee. So I kept taking him coffee in the night to drink and try and keep him going. And when daybreak come, he was just about with it. He managed to do the break. But when I went to see the corporal, he could hardly lift his head and his eyes were blood red. And then we got a note down the next day that said, under no circumstance drink this rice hooch because you can go blind. Anyway, the corporal was already, already knew about it, but you got a few, everybody had a laugh, you got a bit of a few freakish incidents. Wow, yeah. And the major knew something was wrong. He kept saying, where's Corporal Church, and I had to bluff him and he's busy doing this or whatever, but that was the true story. He was recovering from his hooch. But
tell me about the padre. What was he like?
Who?
The padre.
There was our own padre, and then once, I think month, we used to get a divisional padre. And they were both very, very nice men. And I was always keen to go. So I used to go and round the lads up, and we'd have a service, and it was actually enjoyed and well attended. They would just give it where we were on the hill, or whatever. But it was always like a welcome. It was a bit like letters from home. It was a bit of normality. So it did. And actually, the padre, when we went on leave to Tokyo, after 6 months, you were allowed what they call rest and recuperation leave in Tokyo. And when we went to Tokyo, he was on the same bus as well. He happened to get his leave the same time. But you wouldn't believe the driving in Tokyo in those days. It was the biggest vehicle takes place. They drove vehicles like madmen. It just didn't seem to be any rules of the road. And the fella in the bus, because it was a big, quite a reasonable size, we were amazed. He kept like driving at smaller things, and they had to get out of the way and that. And I always remember the padre, one of the lads in the end, he says, "Padre, for goodness sake," he says, "get your hands together." He says, "We're never going to make it to the camp, Yeah.
Did you do a lot of singing because of the Welsh, the valleys?
Yes. No, that was a very interesting one. When we went in reserve, one of the officers that I'd been with in the winter, Lieutenant Brunel, he'd been with the machine guns. Then he came with us. We swapped our chap, and he came with us. So having a lot to do with, I knew the officers pretty well, and on active service, it's not like barracks. You can treat them like a normal chap, obviously. You don't salute them every 2 minutes or whatever. Brunel said to me, we ought to form a battalion choir. So I went round and rounded up some of the lads and said, and we decided. that we give the Norfolks a presentation while we're in reserve. And I said to this Brindlecoombe, I said, I can sing the #1 Korean song. I taught one of the Koreans, I said, teach me a #1. It's called Adidong. Adidong, adidong, adadi, oh, oh. Now, whenever I sang it, all the Koreans used to say, #1, #1. They'd stop working if they were working. They'd say, #1 either. And anything bad was #10, you know. So I said, you think it's worth trying to teach the lads Adidong? Oh, yes, right. So as a finale, we decided to try and teach them Adidong. And I got them doing it pretty reasonable. So we had this one where we sang the traditional songs, which went down well. And they said for like a finale, we're going to sing a Korean. In fact, the Koreans I learned later, I did think of making it a national. It's their oldest song. It goes back to about 16 something. And it's even to this day, it's rated as their #1 song. I don't exactly know what the words mean. I just know how to sing the words. Yeah. So we started singing it. And everybody in the audience, they couldn't help halfway through. They started tittering. And in the end, everybody burst out laughing. And we could hardly get to the end, but it was like a very good ending because everybody burst into laughter, you know. And we also had, on things like that, we had a couple of people come out to give a show. Ted Ray, you remember Ted came out and he sent you back in small groups behind the line. They set up a stage, and I went back, and it was really good. It was, and then they said next day they said to me, "Will you go back again?" I said, "Why? What's the point of going back twice?" I said, "I've seen. I know it's very good and all that." They said, "Well, there are going to be some Americans and Canadians, and we think they might try and like have a bit of a go, you know, try and be funny a bit." So they said, "What you like? Go back and sit amongst them." And, you know, try and distract them if they try to. So I went back the second time and I sat amongst these Yanks and Canadians. And when Ted Ray walked on the show, he had the most brilliant first line. But as he walked on, one of the Yanks threw a penny on the stage. And Ted had been brought up in the days when they threw fruit at you if you weren't good enough, you know, in Liverpool and that. And he just casually picked it up and he pretended to bite it. And he said, "What do you expect, a dud?" And he just threw it away. And then he said, "I've come out here, specially," he said, "I'm paid by the British government and I've travelled 12,000 miles to you lads," he said, "because I've come to tell you, you are now the owners of British Rail. British Rail had just been nationalised." And he said, "I've got the ablutions at Barnsley." He go 12,000 miles. It's one of the best one-liners I've ever seen, you know. And he went on to give a brilliant performance. And when I got back, I wrote him a letter saying thanks, and he wrote me a nice letter back, you know. But I thought, what a one-liner, you know.
Very good, yeah.
Yeah, and so you had intervals like that, which went down well. And also there was Bill Johnson. He'd done 1,000 Annie Get Your Guns shows. He was the top singer in his day. He came out as well and he gave a brilliant renderings, you know, of them sort of songs, Old Man River and the songs from the shows and that. That was really, it's amazing how that's appreciated by people.
What about things like just general kind of health and keeping your skin diseases and lice and stuff?
Right, well, I used to wash, and this was quite common, and to a certain degree, young national servicemen pick up off each other, you know, if somebody. So I made my mind up right from square one. I was going to change my socks very often, and being sporty, you know, in sport, I mean, you don't leave wet kit on you and stuff, do you? So I used to take my socks off every day, and I'd wash them, and then even in the winter, sometimes put them on me on my back, on me packing, and the sun had come out at dinner time a bit, and Koreans, if they got a fire going, they'd help you. But I used to get and I think pretty true to say most of the lads copied. Then we had special powder, delousing powder. Now, I think some people didn't like, but I used to give myself, you know, douse me pants and things, because I thought, well, I don't want bugs on me, because once they get in, it's not funny, you know. But we did used to get rats and mice. But again, the Yanks were very, to be honest with you, a bit lazy. When we took over from the Yanks in one place, they weren't burying the food like us as we were. We used to dig 12-foot deep pits, and then you throw all the waste food in, pour petrol on it, there's plenty of petrol available, and set fire to it every day. So we were very, very, very fussy on stuff like that, the British Army. And it paid off, because I never knew much of a case of people. Same thing we had our own barber, but eventually he got shot in the foot and we hadn't got the barber. We went on a new position, and I went into, down below us was a bit of a Korean village. And I went into the village and I managed to, one of the Koreans, I said, what's the name for getting your hair cut? And he said, Harry Curry. So I went in and they said, yeah, and they got an old man who come, and I said, you cut my hair? And he said, yeah. So I said, up there on the hill. So he used to cut, the first time, I was the first customer, he came up on the hill, and everybody was laughing because when I sat down on an old petrol drum, he got out like sheep shears. But he was brilliant with them. And when they saw what a good job he made, they took him on as battalion barber. So he used to come round and cut your hair, make sure your hair didn't get too long if you wanted it. So hygiene-wise, the rats, they used to put rat poison down, but we didn't mind the mice. And it might sound funny, but you could almost make a friend of a mice. They would, when you're quiet in the night, they'd come on your table sometime, and they climb onto things and that. We used to just watch them, and we hadn't got any great heart to see the mice off, really. So we used to have one or two mice, and they have a run. They'll come along a certain way once they get used to it, and it didn't exactly encourage them, but we didn't check. But the rats, a friend of mine had a horrible experience that I was with when I was with the 3-inch mortars. I came in off duty one night, and there was a schmozzle in the bunker, and I put the light. We used to make the lights out of old batteries that run down, and he jumped up and he grabbed his run. He was raving. He said, "I'll kill it! I'll kill it! I'll kill it!" I said, "What's the matter, Terry?" And he'd been asleep, and he woke up with a rat nibbling. He must have been a bit of jam on his lip, and he woke up with a rat nibbling a bit of jam on his lip. I mean, horrible. He went mad, he did. And then we had another incident where the sergeant major one day said to me one morning, "Will you have a look at this for me?" And he showed me his berry. And he said, "Can you see anything?" I said, "Yeah, I think I can. They're like little white dots." I said, "Yeah, they're moving." Oh, he said, "Get a tin." We got like a biscuit tin. And he put his hat in the tin and sealed it up. And he sent it back to advanced dressing stations. Apparently, the rats could give you the disease of the eyes, which would make you blind. And when they examined these ones he'd in his berry, he woke up with a rat nibbling his hat. And when he looked, he'd seen these white things. And they said yes, they were these little like mini fleas or whatever they are. So you always had to be on guard. In the wildlife, there was a thing called a mountain lion, but I think they were a wildcat, not a lion. And until you got used to them, they would scare you at night at first, because they used to make a noise like a cat, only loud. And in the night, it used to echo in the village. And then occasionally one would get stuck on the wire or something. So then it'd be like hearing one fight. And there were these terrible cries and yells. And until you got used to it, the first time you heard it, you thought, "There's somebody having a hell of a do down there." So you weren't short of things to keep you on your. And then we had another instance where one officer who came late, he joined us after about 6 months. We used to have fireflies in the summer, and the fireflies are very strange. They just go little lights that go beep beep, just like somebody shining a torch and switching it off. And the first time he saw them, he thought it was enemy, and he stood his patrol, he stood his section too. So ever after that, his section got called the Firefly Platoon. But so you're never short of something going on that was thing. The most of the exchanges were artillery exchanges, and the Chinese would you had to watch it at dinner times. They knew like you'd be having dinner, so then they'd send a bit of harassing fire. But we used to just go in the bunker then, and the most dangerous hit the top of your hill, because then the shrapnel would come down. If they went over, you could tell by the sound after a while, you could tell the sound. You'd go in the paddy fields, well, they'd just sink in the paddy fields and blow a hole, but they wouldn't. But one poor Korean was having a bath, in the tin bath in the paddy field one time. One of our best lads came, and one of these landed about 2 foot away from his bath and blew a really great hole. He was all right as it happened, but he come running on the site shouting, "Number 10, number 10." So you were always, things was always something happening that...
Did you remember ever dealing with this guy Bowler, Sub-Lieutenant Bowler? I mean, how big is this area that all the Welsh are in?
Oh, it was stretched for about 2 miles. Because you tended to occupy hills, and Korea's nothing but hills in North Korea, but the distance between one hill and the next would at least be half a mile or so, in some cases a bit more. So you might be in telephone conversation, or you might get one officer off one hill come to see the officer on your hill, or the sergeant majors might do a bit of scrounging. You know, one might say, I haven't got much tea at the moment. Have you got any tea on your crowd? So he go across to B Company in a jeep and then come back with, you know what I mean? So we used to have to mend lines because the shelling would blow a line out. So as soon as your line was, you'd have to go out and repair it. But what you did, you followed the piece through the undergrowth until you found the broken ends, and then you'd piece it. There's a rather amusing story there too, because we had one lad called Dominic, Cockney, and he was only just learning, he hadn't been with us long. And we sent him out on a line, and he used to get the broken ends and then put them to your field telephone battery, and then you'd ring, and you say, "I've found the broken ends, you see. Give me a quarter of an hour and I'll have them fastened." You made like a figure of 8 knot and put sellotape, insulation tape round. So he found the broken ends. He rang us and said, "I found the broken ends, it shouldn't be long, you can ring through." So after about 20 minutes, I thought, well, he'll have mended it now, so I rang. Well, if it went to earth, the handle on your set would be stiff. And I thought, he can't have mended it. I rang it. So that's it. So about half an hour later, he comes into the bunker and he says, "Who rang that?" I said, "Why?" I said, "Why?" He said, I know you hadn't mended it, but that's no harm. He said, "I had the bare ends in my mouth." I said, "We don't put bare ends, you put the insulated bit in your mouth while you're holding it." So he never forgot that lesson. I could imagine him with that was his teeth and me ringing, you know. Yeah. So, but you would go out, and if it was in the night, there's certain, like the line to the standing patrol had to be maintained 24 hours a day. So even if it's in the middle of the 1 o'clock in the morning, if that went down, you would have to go out and mend it. We went out one night, 3 of us, in the winter, and it took us about half an hour to mend it because it was so cold. As you took your gloves off, you could only fiddle for about a couple of minutes, and then you'd have to put your hands under your arms and let one of the other lads have a go while you tried to get warm again. And we had to keep passing it backwards and forwards just to mend a little fiddling break because it was so, so bitterly cold. But that one had to be made. If they were shelling, you wouldn't probably go out when they're shelling. But then again, occasionally you got caught out when you were, they only had to shift a few degrees when they were shelling. And 1 minute it's on one hill. And I had a very close squeak one time where we was wiring when I was with the mortars, and they started shelling the Norfolks, but you could see the shells bursting. It's only like watching a film then. But I thought myself, they shift a few degrees, we're right in line. The next minute, there was 3 of us doing this wiring, and we used to dig slit trenches all around the site in various places for emergency. So if you had a sudden shelling, you get somewhere to dive into out the way. And if a shell gets close to you, you get a sort of, I suppose it's the air, you get like a thump. You get like a, as if somebody's,
Shockwave.
yeah, a shockwave. So you knew, the pair of us, without thinking, the three dived for the same trench. I think I was second in and another lad on top of me, and the one on the bottom yelling. But the shell hit the bomb bay in the mortar bay, which had about 300 bombs in. And when we took over from the Americans, they hadn't bothered. What we used to do was make the bomb bay such that it had very strong logs, then earth, and then rocks, so that if a shell landed, it would set off before it penetrated. And lucky we'd done that, because it had hit these rocks and blew up. And as it happened, none of us got hurt, but it was only literally where you are from us when it dropped on the down there. But if we'd have left it like the Americans done, it could have set a whole load of bombs off there with no knowing what might have happened. So it was a funny situation. Sometimes it goes so quiet, you'd have a job to believe you were in a war once you got well organised, with your bunkers and your food, and then somebody would get killed on a patrol or something, and you'd sort of.
So did you, just going back to this bowler, did you ever hear of any of his patrols, or did you ever wire into any of his patrols?
Not that can attach to him, but the patrol, when I was in the winter, they had to come through our position because we were the most forward one. So we frequently met patrols going in and coming back, chatting. But to be honest with you, I wouldn't attach them particularly to any officer, because more often than not, like one officer amongst 20 blokes or something, you would talk to the lads more than anything. It was terrible nerve-wracking for them, because they used to come back ashen, being out all night, and very often they'd be absolutely ashen-faced and worn out, and the tension of it and that. And one of the patrols, one of them, that was the only prisoner we lost, I think, on one patrol. They'd snatched one of the lads and run off with him. Somebody shot him in the leg, I think, and ran up on his shoulder. I've got a feeling he died he was repatriated, but I think he died some years ago. Lieutenant Wild. He was a nice man, he was easy to get on with, but he had a habit of disappearing. In fact, I know the CO told him off eventually, because he would phone and he was nearly always out somewhere. And he came back this day, and he'd swapped his British 38 pistol for a 45, American 45. Now, he shouldn't have done that. Sergeant Jones, the sergeant, wasn't very happy at all. Well, he brought it in and he was looking at it, and Sergeant Jones said, "Can I have a look at it?" So when Sergeant got hold of it, he pulled the bullets out the bullets in those are in the actual handle on the 45, and he did, he looked around it and he said, "Battle looks a bit worn and things." And then he put it down on one of the bunkers beds, and as an afterthought, Sergeant Jones, because Wilde had left the bullets out of it, you see, so he put them in, and as an afterthought, he took them out. So when Wilde came in, he picked up the pistol, a stupid thing to do, he pointed at me and fired it. And he came near to planting him. I called him, silly smoker. And of course, he was shocked, because he realised what he'd done. It was all apologies. So he disappeared. His bunker was just attached to our main bunker, and him and Jones come back and he says, "What are you going to do?" I says, "Well, I'm not going to do anything, because we're here to fight Chinese, not each other." But I said, "It's a bloody stupid thing to do." So he came and apologised. And then a day or so later, there's probably a peace offering, he got me a pair of Canadian length boots. Everybody wanted them. You couldn't get them for love nor money. So he brought me them boots, which I had until I left Korea. They were really marvellous, those. But it was a damn silly, it was not a British Army thing to, you never point a gun at anybody unless you're going to use it, But he was a nice man himself, but he was a bit gung-ho, and he eventually got transferred to another company. I just met in the odd time when I was out mending lines. And in fact, the last time I met him, he had a batman called Jones, and Jones was known as the wide boy. He always wanted to know what was going on and everything. And this Jones said to me, "Do you want some socks?" I said, "Aye." So he gave me some socks, because they used to get parcelled, but most of them never got to the front line. The people would be picking them off before they got there. And I was talking to this Wild, we were having a chat, and Wild says to me, he says, "You know Jones?" I said, "Oh, I know him well, I was in training with Jones." He said, "I can't make me mind up whether I'm batting for him or he's batting for me. He's one of them blokes that's so useful, you know, get me something and he'd fed it out and get it. Like, but on the other hand, the next minute he'd probably be borrowing your kit to do something else, you know." But yeah, so that was an incident I could have done without. But you know, these things happen, don't they? And then we had Wild, and then we got this Lieutenant Manello. It made things a lot better, because he was well thought of by the CO as well. In fact, the CO used to invite him back on Sundays to have dinner at HQ, and he didn't used to invite the Major. But he got shot up in the end on a patrol just before, not on a patrol, on a full-scale attack. They had to put a company attack him, and he got badly shot up, and they had to drag him back on a blanket. And then the last time I saw him was in Cardiff when we were getting demobbed. And he looked, you know, he'd lost weight, he looked the shadow of the man I'd known, because he was always full of fun, you know, and you could have a joke with him and that. And then when my book came out, he wrote me a really nice letter, and I think I told you he became colonel to the regiment eventually. He recovered properly. I think somebody said he'd lost a finger or something, but he recovered, and he's seen out his time in the army. But I've got a feeling I'm pretty sure he died some years ago. But the CO thought a lot of him. He took out several patrols, and
okay, but you just touched on it there. Let's move on then. So, what did you know about? How much were you looking forward to leaving?
Well, to be honest with you, up until it would be about August, we went in reserve twice. Once after the winter, round about so for a month, and then we went after the summer. So round about August, we came back then, and we took over from the Australians, but they were in as we understood it, they were at the bottom of a big U shape, and we were quite away, like say 2 miles away from the enemy. So for us, that was like being in reserve to a degree. And the Australians said there's not much going on. We had quite a lot of work to do in tidying up. The Australians were really nice, easy fellas to get on with, but there's not many armies as disciplined as the British when we do things. I know it's funny, but it has to be done properly, just the way it is. So they're a bit more relaxed than we would be. So even though we only had about a month or so to go, past 6 weeks or so, we started sorting out some of the lines, which we would put a post up outside and tie each wire and have a label on it, so we knew exactly if we wanted to follow a wire, you know, where to follow it to and that. And we even went out on some that weren't working to find out where the brakes were and put them back in business again. In fact, I had a bit of I wouldn't say a close shave, but a bit of a fright there. I went out on one line, and it came up into one of our company positions, but it came through some not particularly well put barbed wire type of thing, you know. And I was getting near to where the lads were. I might have been, say, 50 yards off where the thing, and all of a sudden I set a flare off. Now, we didn't use flares very often. Our CO said if you fire off flares, you show the enemy your position. You know your own position. You're better off. So it took me by surprise, but when I did, I thought, oh heck, I hope I haven't come in a minefield. It gave me a hell of a shock. I thought, oh me, so using the butt of my rifle, which we've been taught very carefully, and I had to cut a couple of flares to get to the last 30 or 40 yards, which I wasn't very happy about. And it got to a point then where we'd only got weeks to go, I think. So there wasn't much point in doing. But Terry Hatchie, who I'd been paired up with for quite a while when I was with the mortars as well, we did get fired on one day. We were told that the Chinese were, they were quite a long way away on a hill, but there seemed to be nothing doing. There was no shelling or nothing. And this day we'd just gone outside the bunker and we were standing on a piece of land, and several bullets went whizzing past us. So we got down quick, and then when we made more inquiries and stuff, the Chinese must have, I don't know what kind of bullets they were, but they were definitely still watching us, and if they could have a go, they were having a go. So we had to be a bit more cautious. And then the last week, we went a bit farther back still, and I got attached to an officer, a major, to do some training for some troops that had just come out. So they were giving them some experience, battle training, and I went round with this officer just reporting, telling, he giving them scores and all the rest of it that goes with it. So that was just, and then we got to a point before we found about it. We were under canvas, and it rained a lot. We were all right because we dug trenches round, but the lads who had just come out hadn't got used to it yet. Some of them were getting washed out because they hadn't really realised what the weather was like, and then it was a case of you go to a transit camp and then back down. And when we got to Busan, there's transit camp there. We did a bit of swimming off the coast while we were just waiting. But it was just everybody was a bit worried in case they were giving everybody medicals. Everybody was a bit worried in case they said you got something that you couldn't go back with or something. Because it's a bit like, I did prison visiting for years, and prisoners, when they've been long term, they get absolutely worried stiff in the last couple of months in case they lose the remission or something happens that they can't. So they call it gate fever, and it's a bit like that when you're going back. And even when you get on the boat going back, until you're literally 300 or 400 miles away, you don't feel that you're 100% sure that it mightn't turn around and something happens and you have to go back again. So it's a funny feeling, that, yeah. And you sort of start realising, in a way, what you've probably come through more than when you're in it. When you're in it, you get on with it and you don't look about tomorrow very much. You like letters from home and things like that. And we had a very funny incident at the Christmas when we were on Pioneer Hill. The Chinese planted a Christmas tree in no man's land. And because the assault pioneers, they thought there might be booby trap, they sent them out and they got first choice. So we had quite a few souvenirs off it. But later on, a lot of officers and people came up trying to scrounge these souvenirs and that,
What were they?
There were things like, I've still got one. It's a little enamel brooch that says, with a dove on. It's quite nicely made. It says "Demand peace, not war." And I actually, at the time, I had a safe conduct pass which said that if you give this self up, the Chinese will let you in. I used to carry it in my pocket for fun. I said, I'm all right, But they had handkerchiefs and things like that. But they would all have a little slogan on to the effect that, the Chinese are all right. Inversely, I used to have, but I gave them to Liverpool Museum, we used to drop leaflets over the Chinese, and of course they'd have Stalin's face on, a big face, and all these troops marching and things. But it's trying to show the North Koreans that the Stalin and co were a bad lot,
How do you feel about Korea now then, so many years later?
Well, war is a negation of light. It's the worst thing that can happen to people. By its very nature, it brings out the worst in the best in people. And people who survive it will probably, depending on their experiences, they'll carry some very strong experiences with them for the rest of their life. I get a bit annoyed about politicians who talk glibly about these things, because being factual, the people who have generals and people hardly ever see any action. The people that do the really hard bit, when it's finished, you just go away and make the best of life as what you can. There's not enough done. There's more now, but there's not enough done for people who get war problems, whether it's civilians or things. So it's something not to be entered lightly. It tends to be because of power seekers, which, you know, I suppose it's a trait in human beings. But I do feel that not too many politicians don't speak up when they should, and then, you know, and then they're too glib at, we will do this, we will do that. They don't do anything, you know. If they had to fight. I wrote a poem recently when I was watching Passchendaele, and it's true, the bombs and things from there now are lay buried and covered by nature, and they still find them. But all that suffering over a few yards of land, if the people who pushed the troops into it had to be there, I don't think they would have been keen to do it. This is the problem.
Do you feel the same about Korea?
Korea, of probably all the battles fought since the last war, was probably the most important, because what people don't remember now is that Stalin and the Chinese had plans for world domination. They really thought that communism was the answer to the world's problems. It's hard to imagine now because it's only a theory now, but at the time it was serious. They really thought that if they could make the whole of the world communism, it would solve everybody's problems. So had they got to the bottom of Korea, they would have then menaced Japan, Australia and New Zealand and the Far East. And it doesn't bear thinking about what it might have led to.
So it was a just war?
It was as just as any war can ever be. And it was the only answer at the time. And you know, if they hadn't have stopped them when they did, you could have by now you could have a slave world. But sadly, what happens, like it did between the 1914 war and the 1945 war, the politicians and people of power do not use the time properly. They tell too many lies. They don't face up to the realistic problems that people have. And when you look backwards, the 14 war, or the terrible things there, and within 20 years, we're having another war because they ignored Hitler. They pretended he didn't exist. You know, and it's this constant, 1 minute they talk brave, or certain people do, and the next minute the real problems like we're living through now. There's far too much cheating on the internet. There's far too much silly talk. Children are being shown filthy pictures. You can't justify that. I love children. And it really makes me blood boil to think of the things they show kids. It's terrible. If after the last war they'd show the things they're showing about children that have been fighting on the streets.
Look, we'll leave it at that point. What I'd like you to do is I'd like you to recite a poem. Sing us something bright.
But it's a poem on war, really. I've written all sorts, you know, funny poems and monologues and things. I always had a leaning towards it. When I was in I won't keep you, but when I was in career, I memorised a lot of Kipling's poems and that. The lads used to like to hear them, you know, because the Mad Karoo and Gunga Din and all that, they're very good poems when you read them. They're sometimes frowned on by classical, but they actually usually have quite a good sort of...
so this is one that you've read?
This is one...
Read this out.
Yeah. It's called The Beast of War. There's a voracious beast that prowls the earth to hurt and maim and kill. Its teeth are steel, its eyes are fire, it has an iron will. Its thirst for blood is never quenched, its feet are never still, as it prowls the earth with an evil eye, searching for a kill. It was born of fear and suckled on want, to death became a slave, and millions tremble at his name, but only one can save. The name the monster cannot bear is hallowed for all time. The name is short and to the point and gives a peace sublime. So do not fear and do not doubt. There is a hope away. Christ is the hope, he holds the key, and he will have his say.